great to have you here and to really get your expertise on this and really expand on the report. So I really like to start with the basics. Just really look at the problem. If you could explain what the problem is, are you a solution looking for a problem, or is there really an issue with lobbying and transparency in New Zealand currently?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question, Andrea. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Health Coalition Aotearoa for organising this event. Thank you, Grant, very much for the karakia and for welcoming us in that way. Yeah, look, I mean, I think there absolutely is an issue with lobbying in New Zealand. That's not to say that lobbying per se is a bad thing. I don't think it is. In the report that I've written, I've just defined lobbying as attempts to influence government by individuals and organizations. And so that's completely legitimate, and that can be a useful activity. That can be a process that brings information to the notice of ministers and public servants and government that they wouldn't have otherwise. But there are, obviously a lot of potential concerns, ways that that process could go wrong or could happen in ways that we don't regard as being acceptable. The most obvious of that is that lobbying can lead to an imbalance in terms of who's got access to decision makers and who's got influence over them, because obviously it's a principle of a good democracy that everyone's got at least an equal opportunity to have their say to decision makers and to influence those decisions. If some people's views end up having more weight in a particular discussion, that should be because they've got better arguments, better information, not because they're better resourced, not because they've got the time and the money and the contacts to spend a lot of time lobbying government. You can also have lobbying that's sort of done unethically, that involves sort of bribery or providing incorrect information, or it can involve people abusing information in the sense of if you have people who are ministers and they go straight from having confidential cabinet information and then into using that information to the advantage of private clients, if they go straight into becoming lobbyists, then that's something we might think is concerning as well. So I think there are definitely, broad scale reasons to be concerned about how lobbying is done. There are really good reasons to try to bring transparency to it, try to bring a bit of rigor, try to make sure that it is, we're getting the positive side of lobbying, if you like, without all of the negative aspects that can come with it.
Okay, all right. Just a reminder, by the way, Danica's just posted in the chat. If you do have a burning question, please put it in the chat and just keep your microphones on mute for now. So yeah, so just getting back to your points there, obviously the positive and negative sides of lobbying. Have you seen? I was thinking about this morning because I was trying myself to cast back to think of any sort of lobbying scandals in New Zealand. Have you seen any examples that concern you and that really would illustrate the negative side of lobbying in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for a start, so if you think about what lobbying can bring, you're often talking about that there's a distinction between access and influence. And so access is relatively easy to prove up to a point because you sometimes know who's getting in front of whom, who's talking to whom. And then you've got the questions about who's influencing whom, and that's much harder to prove because that's much more elusive and it's not always clear why a decision's been made a particular way. But on the first point about access, so one of your journalistic colleagues, Guy Aspinall, his series last year, Mate, Comrade, Brother, certainly showed extraordinary levels of access enjoyed by lobbyists. Lobbyists is able to text ministers, get immediate responses from public servants, get their clients immediately in front of public servants, get knowledge about, is this paper, when is this paper going to cabinet, who's in charge of this particular thing, who's going on this delegation, can we get the minister to attend this event that we're holding? So a level of access that's just, above and beyond that which ordinary people can enjoy. And so that, I think, by itself is reason to be concerned because generally influence does follow from access, even if you can't always prove it. in terms of when things have actually been changed in actual sort of specific scandals, I mean, I think you could go back to, well, I mean, at the very least to the 80s and 90s, for instance, with the farming and business lobbyists basically scuppering early attempts to try to deal with climate change. You know, the documentary Hot Air is full of descriptions of how those lobby groups blocked the introduction of an emissions trading scheme, you know, way back in the 1990s. Something that was obviously in the public interest, and which we now have, and which is now almost universally agreed to be in the public interest, and which we should have had in the 1990s. And that was stopped by lobbying, basically. You can think about things like the Sky City scandal under the John Key government, you know, where the Auditor General was very clear that, you know, Sky City, through its lobbying of that government, through its contacts with ministers, had got an inside track on the convention centre deal in a way that was, you know, profoundly unjust, and which obviously gave Sky City a huge advantage that other firms didn't have. You've had the Food and Grocery Council lobbying, delaying public health measures like the inclusion of folic acid in bread, something that did happen under the last government but should have happened a long time ago. You know, you can think about all the sort of the dirty politics type things. You know, you can think about what else? Chris Farfoy going straight from being a minister into becoming a lobbyist. Then you've got, you know, the sort of the revolving door. You know, the last Labour government, you know, a startlingly large number of Jacinda Ardern's chiefs of staff were lobbyists who just sort of went smoothly into working in government, having huge access to privileged information, and then out the other side able to use, you know, that privileged information to the benefit of their private clients. You've had things like the container deposit scheme, which was going to try to deal with plastic waste, scrapped, potentially because there was a huge lobbying effort against it from the plastics and sort of container industry. You've now got questions about what influence does the lobbying of tobacco, the tobacco industry, have over the new government, in particular some of the ministers linked to New Zealand First. So I think there's, you know, although it's often hard to find the smoking gun, you know, the moment when a minister says, oh, well, I will do this because the lobbyists told me to, you know, life doesn't work like that. Then you look at that list of scandals and you think, yeah, there's something to be concerned about here.
Okay. The counter argument is, though, that, and I'd like to get your response to this, is that reducing access, direct access from businesses to the government is also not a good thing. And I think one of the examples that would be raised by business and industry is that the previous government was reluctant to meet with business. They didn't have the same access. They couldn't pick up the phone and talk to ministers, and the number of meetings with ministers was dramatically reduced, which led to issues like perhaps in COVID, when mistakes were made because ministers didn't understand businesses, they didn't understand how businesses work, they didn't understand supply chains, and there was no possibility to make a case for regulations and rules and during COVID to be made flexible. So there is a counter argument that actually it is a good thing for businesses to have access to ministers, to government, and it allows for better decision making. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, look, I think that's an interesting point. Although, I mean, in the absence of data, it's hard to know if the basic claim there is even true, that business had diminished access, or, you know, a level of access that was sort of low enough to be problematic. And just anecdotally, I mean, talking to people who worked for senior ministers in the Labour government, I mean, their view is they were constantly hearing from business, and that, you know, business had a hotline to the very highest echelons of government, and they were quite capable, and they did get in the ear of, you know, the finance minister or the prime minister and say, hey, look, we've got all this expertise, we could sort you out with all this PPE, you know, why don't you just clear the way for us? I mean, that's anecdotally the level of contact I've heard that they had. And you think about those sort of business advisory councils that Ardern convened. I mean, actually, I think I would argue that business, certainly big business, maybe it was different for small businesses, big business enjoyed exceptional levels of access to the last government, I would say, actually. And then the second part of my argument, I guess, would be that this isn't necessarily always about limiting the access of businesses. I mean, government does need to be able to hear from business. If you're going to regulate something, you need to hear from the people you're regulating. They're entitled to put their view forward, even if you don't ultimately go with it. But that's not necessarily, it's certainly not always about diminishing the contact business has with government. So one of the main instruments that other countries, is increasingly standard in other countries, is a register of lobbying. And so that just means if you're a business or indeed, potentially a large NGO or a third-party lobbyist, you just have to, on a publicly accessible register, list the contacts that you're having with ministers and MPs and senior public servants. So you just have to say, well, I had this meeting, we exchanged these emails, we exchanged these texts. So it's not limiting anything, it's just bringing sunlight. And then I think what you would want to see is a balance. So if you had a process where a minister was hearing a lot from business and not at all from NGOs, then that would be a problem. It wouldn't necessarily say, well, you meet less with business, but it would just mean you need to meet more with people who are maybe putting a counter view to the well-resourced business lobby.
Okay, all right. Well, just to go, I do really want to drill down on your on the options that you've presented in the report in more detail in a little bit. But just on the register, couldn't you argue? I mean, I know who ministers are meeting with because their diaries are regularly published, and that includes who they're meeting with, when, for how long, and then also the events that they attend. So couldn't you argue that a register is just extra layers of regulation and more onus on more onerous on not just business but other NGOs and organizations who engage in lobbying with ministers? Like, isn't the solution already there? It's already a pretty transparent system.
Yeah, look, I think there's merit in the ministerial diaries that are published, but obviously you'll know, I mean, there's probably 3 points you can make there. Obviously, you'll know as a user of them, they're pretty insufficient. I mean, they're, scattered PDFs published, sometimes with huge delays. There's no penalties for not publishing them. I also think that I'm not really confident that everything that ministers do that's of note is in there, because it very much depends what their staff have decided to record. It's probably only the relatively formal meetings. It's generally only meetings or maybe long scheduled phone calls. So it's not capturing the stuff that, necessarily, it's not capturing the unfiltered access. People who've worked for ministers have said to me, it's the unfiltered access that lobbyists really want. It's just being able to ring the minister, where there aren't civil servants sitting around in the room, or just being able to text them. And so, I mean, I think there's huge amounts of stuff that's missed out of the current ministerial diaries. Secondly, lobbying isn't just important when it's applied to ministers. I think lobbying of senior public servants is very important. Lobbying of other MPs who are not ministers is also important. And in transparency registers internationally, including the Irish one, lobbying of all those people is captured as well. So it goes beyond just ministers. And thirdly, I mean, I think if there's going to be a burden of compiling this information, it should be on the people who are getting some kind of commercial benefit from this exchange. So that's the lobbyist, rather than ministerial staff having to do it. And the last thing I guess I'd say is that, if the lobbying register works well, as it does in Ireland, I think, where there's a nice smooth back end, it's very easy. You just go on when you've, had a meeting with a minister or an email exchange, you just log into the back end, write a quick note that you did that, end of every quarter, you sum up all the interactions you've had with senior decision makers, you press send, and then it gets published. It actually doesn't seem to be a huge regulatory burden. And in Ireland, it's widely accepted, including by their Institute of Public Affairs professionals, their PR sort of people, that's an important thing to do. It's part of the system of democracy and transparency, and it doesn't seem to be viewed as particularly onerous by them.
Okay, all right. So what about getting around the I mean, Wellington is particularly unusual in that levels of access are very informal. It's a really small place. You know, there's plenty of times I get access to politicians just by wandering around Wellington's cafes. So how do you regulate for or account for those informal interactions which happen so frequently in Wellington?
Well, you can't necessarily. It's you know, it's a debated question, I think, amongst academics internationally as to whether you can or should try to capture informal contact. The way most lobbying registers work is that it's trying to capture what you might call premeditated contact. So if a lobbyist, you know, sends an email, arranges a meeting, makes a phone call, and it's clearly predetermined, premeditated, they've got something premeditated, something that they wanted to raise with that decision maker, that is the sort of thing that should be recorded. Obviously, what that leaves out of scope are all the informal contacts. So things where you bump into someone, or you say that you just happen to bump into them in the, well, what used to be called the Koru Lounge, for instance, or at some other kind of gathering at a cocktail party or whatever. Now, the Irish system does actually, it's unusual. It says that you have to log all of that. You know, if you bump into the minister, even at the supermarket, and you talk about something that's relevant to a government decision, then you need to register that contact. I wouldn't suggest doing that in New Zealand. I mean, I do think those contacts are important, but in my draft report, I've said that would probably be too controversial. It could be seen as having a chilling effect on free speech. That was one of the points raised against the Greens' attempt to regulate lobbying in 2012. So in any sort of viable register of lobbying, you would probably have to keep that stuff out of scope and just accept that it's better to capture some things, the formal premeditated stuff, than to capture nothing at all.
Okay, all right. So a very basic question, and I think that we should talk about is what exactly is a lobbyist? Who are lobbyists? How do we characterize and therefore regulate them?
Yeah, it's a hugely important question, and it's potentially the most difficult question in the whole area of regulating lobbying, and it's arguably the one that sunk that Green attempt a decade ago to regulate lobbying here in New Zealand. Because quite often when people are talking about lobbyists, they probably have in mind third-party lobbyists. So people who work for firms that basically do nothing except lobbying. And so they'll have in mind maybe someone like Neil Jones, who's a high-profile commentator on 9 to Noon and other places, as well as being a lobbyist, or his co-worker Ben Thomas, or people like that, people from Saunders Unsworth, those sort of well-established firms. Now, of course, those people are lobbyists, and they probably do a reasonably large proportion of the lobbying. But if lobbying is just attempts to influence government decisions, then obviously a lot of lobbying is done not by people who are third-party contractors like Neil Jones and people like that, but is done in-house. So it's done by the person who's called the government relations professional or manager of government relations or whatever within that particular firm or organization. And so, for instance, under left-wing governments, whoever's the president of the Council of Trade Unions is a pretty influential lobbyist. Under right-wing governments, whoever is the head of Business New Zealand, so Kirk Hope, is a pretty influential lobbyist. And under governments of both stripes, whoever is the head of Fed Farmers is an extremely influential lobbyist, because the data tells us that Fed Farmers always has huge access to government. So your definition of who is a lobbyist can't just be the third-party consultant lobbyist, because then you're going to miss all the lobbying that's done by people who work within, wider organizations. And so, but then the question is, so how do you define, is everybody potentially a lobbyist at that point? I mean, that's obviously not workable. And so where people have ended up internationally, I mean, there's no consensus, but the Irish system, again, to refer to that, because I do think it's quite a good model, it says you're a lobbyist if you're a third-party lobbyist, but also if you're trying to influence government and you're employed by a company that has at least 10 staff, a sort of trade association like Business New Zealand, or a union that employs at least one staff member, or an NGO that employs at least one staff member. And what they're trying to do there is say, we want to capture the organizations that have got a bit of resource behind them, that are clearly, big players in some shape or form. We want to capture their lobbying. We don't want to capture the contacts that totally voluntary organizations have, people who don't have any staff members or just ordinary members of the public have with government. So that's how Ireland defines what a lobbyist is. That does bring quite a lot of NGOs within scope, potentially quite small NGOs that have got one staff member, then have to register their contacts with government. You can add other thresholds in. So you could say you only have to register your lobbying, if you're inside the Irish definition, but also if you've had more than 10 contacts with decision makers in a 12-month period, or if you have a budget over a certain size or whatever. Basically, what regulators are always trying to do is hone in on the lobbying that's most professionalized, that's got the most resources behind it, that's really got a bit of oomph and a bit of weight and is likely to sway government decisions. They're trying to keep that within scope, and they're trying to keep out of scope just very ordinary contacts between poorly resourced people or organizations and government. But there isn't internationally any consensus on that yet, and there isn't any magical way, I think, of defining who is and isn't a lobbyist. You're just trying to find a workable proxy that means you focus on the lobbying that's of most concern.
Okay. So the lobbying sector or industry, if you like, are working on a voluntary code of conduct at the moment, working with the Ministry of Justice on that. So how do you obviously don't think that that's enough?
No, I mean, the three main instruments for regulating lobbying that are now pretty standard overseas are the Register of Lobbying, which we've already talked about, the stand down periods for senior for ministers and MPs, during which time they can't go and become lobbyists. And then the third mechanism typically used is a code of conduct. And what that's trying to do is it's trying to get the people who are doing the lobbying to think about their standards, to think about how they're doing their lobbying, to think about what kind of ethical standards they want to meet, what kind of behaviors they want to bar, what they want to do in part to raise the reputation of what they do with the public and, and sort of display their legitimacy. I think it's fair to say that countries internationally have struggled to make those codes of conduct meaningful. Obviously, if you, I think the idea would be a mandatory code of conduct for me, one that is, potentially designed in conjunction with the industry itself, but which is ultimately, overseen by a government body, by a regulator, and one that has teeth and one that has real consequences. So I think it should be the case that if you had a mandatory code of conduct for lobbyists and people are found to be in breach of it, well, that can be investigated in the first place, that there are standards you can actually hold people to, and that there are then sanctions for not meeting those standards in the code of conduct. And the obvious sanction would be that you're barred from lobbying, you're barred from having contact with decision makers. And it's worth noting that National, in opposition, did say that we should have a mandatory code of conduct. But at the moment, yes, they're just continuing the work that Labour had set in train, which was about trying to get the lobbying industry to agree on a voluntary code of conduct. Now, look, I think a voluntary code of conduct would be better than nothing at all, because it can't hurt the industry to think about its own ethical standards and try to raise them. But it is questionable whether that would really have any teeth. At the moment, there isn't even an industry body of lobbyists that could oversee it, even in a sort of voluntary self-regulation sense. So it's not clear to me how that's going to produce any outcomes that are actually going to improve the way in which lobbying is carried out in New Zealand.
Okay, all right. So one thing that we haven't talked about, and perhaps we should have done in that discussion of what is a lobbyist is, I mean, one of the best and most successful lobbyists in the country works for a law firm. So how do you encompass the legal profession, because they have their own standards and code of conduct and industry body? How do you propose that you deal with lawyers who essentially lobby the government, but under the guise of the legal profession?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think to some extent you could extend it to what used to be called the accountancy firms, KPMG and Ernst and Young, people like that, who I think increasingly offer lobbying services to their clients. I mean, for a starter, that just reinforces the point that you have to try to regulate the function, not the form. Don't think there's much point in just regulating people who go around calling themselves lobbyists, the third-party lobbyists, because then you're going to miss all this other stuff that is lobbying. It's just not always calling itself lobbying. Look, I mean, the answer is that lawyers and consultants and whoever else have to come under the ambit of a regulatory system. And although that creates some complexities, it's also a problem that's been solved over and over again internationally because, there's at least 20 OECD countries that regulate lobbying in some meaningful way. So they've all come up against this issue and they've all solved it. And look, the details can get a bit complex, but basically, I mean, you can't have an opt-out, obviously, for lawyers, because otherwise all the lobbying would just shift into the legal industry and then all just say, hey, we're not covered. But basically, every country that's dealt with this has come to some kind of compromise thing where you sort of separate out the different roles that lawyers play. So, yes, legal privilege, client confidentiality is a very important sort of pillar of the way that lawyers operate. But you can kind of separate out things where lawyers are acting in their sort of pure lawyer way, if you like, where they are representing people who've been subjects of prosecution or whatever, or government disciplinary processes or whatever. You can carve that out of a lobbying regime and say, no, you've got confidentiality of that. That's fine. You don't have to disclose your clients there. But if the lawyers are just doing the same thing that third-party lobbyists do, if they are contacting government and arguing for changes, law changes, policy changes, grants, changes in regulation, whatever, that would benefit their clients, then that is lobbying. And at that point, they have to register their lobbying activity just like anyone else would have to.
Okay, all right. So because we've sort of touched on it piecemeal, I think it would be worthwhile just covering some of the other countries and how they're dealing with it. I know you've obviously mentioned Ireland a few times. I think the report also mentions Canada, Australia, France. So, like I said, you obviously you like what Ireland's done in this space. So, who else is doing it well, and who's doing it badly, and who can we learn from?
Yeah, I think the Irish system has got a lot going for it, and that's not to say that it's perfect or that we could just import it here wholesale. I mean, quite apart from anything else, it's worth pointing out that, I mean, the Irish don't have to deal with issues around the Treaty of Waitangi, for instance, and they don't, they have to think about, well, what's the relationship between iwi and the Crown, for instance, and is that very different to lobbying? So, with the caveat, I'm not saying we could just import something willy-nilly. Yeah, I do think the Irish system is quite good. I mean, I think there's sort of a logical progression that you step through in some countries, like and Australia and the UK are good examples of this, where they only really try to regulate third-party lobbyists. So the only people who have to register their activity, the only people who are bound by codes of conduct are their equivalents of Neil Jones and Ben Thomas and Saunders Unsworth and people like that. And I think that's doing it badly because, at that point, all the lobbying that's done by the equivalents of Business New Zealand and Federated Farmers and whoever else, if they do it in-house with their own government relations professionals, that's all invisible under that system. And so I think that's pretty hopeless, personally. The Canadian system regulates third-party lobbyists, and then it tries to hone in on government relations professionals within organizations by saying you're a lobbyist if you're working in-house and you spend at least 20% of your time doing the lobbying, which seems like a really elegant solution, but in practice, it's no one I spoke to in Canada thought that was a good system, because how do you define whether you're spending 20% of your time on lobbying or not? What exactly counts as time spent on lobbying is very technical. And so I think you then end up with the Irish system, really, where you say, yes, it's third-party lobbyists, and then it's anyone in an organization contacting government who's got some resources behind them. The problem, like I said earlier, is that can bring a lot of people into the net, maybe too many people, although it seems to work okay in Ireland. So do you want something more like the French system where, you only have to register if you've had a certain number of contacts with decision makers, if you've, had more than 10 meetings or sent more than 10 emails to ministers or senior public servants or whatever. The problem is the more things you add into your system, the more loopholes you're creating for people to hide. And there is something quite nice about the Irish system and the absolute sort of simplicity of it. But something like the French system does maybe do a better job of capturing the people who are really in ministers' ears all the time, the people who are really in there, the people who would be in there in the beehive, who are very heavily networked, who are much more likely to be having a level of influence we might be concerned about. So there's a whole, like I said at the start, there's a whole range of approaches. I don't think there's a perfect one, but I do think some are better than others.
Okay, all right. And I was going to ask you about this, but since you mentioned it, the report talks about how perhaps Te Ao Maori and the treaty haven't really been considered in the work that's going on or has been done to date. So do you just want to talk about that? Why is it important to consider the treaty in this, and what do you suggest?
Yeah, so I think my work is running in parallel with some other work that Health Coalition Aotearoa have commissioned, which is going to look specifically about how you would ensure that the treaty Te Tiriti is respected through lobbying regulation and that Māori interests aren't harmed. So in a sense, I can't speak to that work in any particular detail, but just at the outline level, sort of the concerns that were raised when the Ministry of Justice, which has been doing this work on lobbying regulation, has held hui with people from Te Ao Māori, the broad outline point has been made is that in many circumstances, Māori aren't just sort of lobbying, or iwi or hapu or whatever, aren't just lobbying government just like anyone else, because that's a relationship where you sort of, in a sense, very crudely got government up here and everyone else is a bit sort of not subservient, but is feeding into government and is subject to its decisions. I mean, obviously, if you take a co-governance view of things, Māori have enjoyed quite a different relationship, iwi Māori groups, in the sense that they're equals to the Crown in a number of these processes, or should be. And so where you get to with that is a view that, well, there are probably instances where Māori organisations are interacting with the Crown on the basis of equals, and so that's not lobbying, and it shouldn't be counted as lobbying. But there would still be instances where, Māori owned businesses, for instance, might be going to government and asking for particular, grants or law changes or policy changes, and that would constitute lobbying in the normal sense of things. So you need some kind of differentiation around how Māori interactions with government are handled. Like I said, the details of that I can't speak to, but I think those are some of the broad concerns that have been raised and which are going to be explored in this other work.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Okay, we're getting. I want to open the floor up for questions, but I do really want to. I want to talk about some of the options that you've presented. You've suggested an act, some new legislation. What would be the key things and the key principles in the legislation, the act that you propose to be introduced?
Well, in the draft report, I've basically said we should adopt the internationally three internationally standard 3 main instruments of lobbying. So the register of who's lobbying whom, the code of conduct, and the stand down period for MPs and senior public servants. And I think, and there also needs to be a government body that has oversight of those instruments so that it regulates. So there's a regulator, and so that can actually enforce those provisions, and it's resourced to enforce them and hand out sanctions. And so that could either be a wider integrity commission. I think in an ideal world, you'd have a body that had oversight of lobbying, but also donations, ministers' interests, all sorts of things. That's relatively unlikely to happen. So failing that, you could just have a lobbying commission, which would be an independent Crown entity, like many of the other commissions that we already have. So those are sort of things that I've said should definitely be in a lobbying act. There is also the question, and this is a big question, but I'll just touch on it briefly, of do you need to go beyond those standard measures? Because, arguably in the other countries where they're used, they've been useful, but they certainly haven't cleaned up all the problems that exist with lobbying. And in particular, the register of who's lobbying whom can just tell you how bad things are. It can just tell you that there are these massive imbalances in who has access to decision makers. Now, the revelation of that imbalance should in itself encourage ministers through a bit of sort of shaming to listen to a wider slate of interests, but it's not guaranteed that that's always going to happen. And it's not always going to be easy to detect those imbalances. So, arguably, I've also sort of floated some ideas, should we be getting officials to report on who they've heard from in every major process of drawing up a new law, for instance, so we can see very clearly if there are imbalances. Something's in the news today, there's the controls around the tobacco industry, who shouldn't really be ever meeting with decision makers behind closed doors under the World Health Organization protocols because the tobacco industry is so bad, crudely speaking. There's an argument you can make greater use of those kinds of protocols, although that would be controversial. And I think we need to just think more, more generally about, what kind of duty there is on decision makers to hear from a balanced slate of interests. But in the first instance, those 3 main mechanisms and a regulator to oversee them, all of that wrapped up into a lobbying regulation act, I think would be pretty crucial and pretty foundational for anything else we might want to do.
Okay, all right. Well, I guess I think that's probably enough for me. I'm going to hand it over to the floor. We've got some questions here. Max, if you're happy enough to answer them, we're not going to record this part of the session.